talks. She is a Regents Professor of Marketing at the UM Business School, so she came over from Missoula, and she works on, I'll let her explain, but high tech and innovations. And the last time she talked, she was talking about technology following biology in terms of using biomimicry to figure out technological innovations and solutions, and it was great.
That was good, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to her talk now on business perspectives and ecological restoration. So thanks, Jakki.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. The talk that I'm going to be giving today is based on about 4 years of research that I've been doing with a group over at UM, working on an NSF project for coupled human-natural systems. And in the team that we've assembled, including Mohr, Ray Calloway, Libby Metcalf, Kara Nelson, Mohr's postdoc Mark Papak, and myself, what we've kind of discovered is in business, we consider ourselves a social science, even though we're in a professional school. And so a lot of the methods that we use are social science methods. And so our team has studied the human dimensions of ecological restoration, including stakeholders, community, citizen collaboratives, landowners, agencies, NGOs, but we have found no research at all that studies how the businesses who actually make money and profit and loss on these huge restoration projects actually go about making their decisions. And so we've included this business domain as a unique aspect of our submissions for this coupled human-natural systems. And as we go through this, I thought I would share with you, in a pretty blunt fashion, what some of our hurdles have been and how we're wrestling with them, with the idea that you all collectively may be able to help us surface some new ways that we could conceptualize or think about some of the hurdles that we've encountered. But through every step of this process, we've continued to use the IOE for funding to continue to collect preliminary qualitative data to support the conceptualization that we're moving forward with our NSF proposal. So I was just telling Kathy that, we're going to submit in November again for the coupled human-natural systems. This will be our third submission, and I said it's either going to be 3 strikes and we're out or a third time is a charm. But at this point, I think all of us are feeling pretty exhausted because we've taken a year out of each cycle to really not just quickly redo it, but to get more data to bolster the case. So as I go through this today, I really encourage you, to jump in at any time, whether you're here in the audience or I don't know how the technology works for people who are out in the virtual world watching this to also feel like they can chime in, but I'm happy to take questions at any time. I do try to stop and breathe occasionally, and that would be a good time to jump in. And even if I'm not breathing, I totally don't care if people just want to try to talk at the same time as me, and eventually I'll stop talking. I talk a lot and I talk really fast, so I don't know if that's good or bad. The title that you see here has changed a little bit from the title that I submitted originally, and the reason for that is because we did get another round of reviews back. This manuscript is under second review now at Restoration Ecology, and the reviewers didn't like the word tension. And so if reviewers don't like something, I just feel like it's really easy to get rid of it. We could change everything to a verb, and so now we're calling those tensions challenges. And so we're hoping that that's a more palatable word. Everybody has idiosyncrasies, and as long as it doesn't compromise kind of the basic intent and integrity of the manuscript, I'm totally fine with semantic changes. And my co-author, Libby, has just had her second baby on December 26th. This is William. And her daughter, Charlie, turns 2. And so to watch Libby manage her career as an untenured assistant professor and have 2 babies through the last 4 years as we go through this process, we work really well together, at least from my perspective. I don't know if she would say the same thing, because I definitely tend to do major 40-hour pushes over 3 days. It's the way my brain works. And I fuel up on coffee and I'll just stay up, and she said, Jakki, could we get the revision done before Will's due date on December 26th? And it's like, no, I doubt that's going to happen. And the due date isn't until January 11th for the manuscript. So I just doubt that's going to happen. And so anyway, she got all her part done. And on January 11th. It's like, Libby, did you want to look at this before I submit it again? She said, yes. So I said, okay, how many hours do you think you might need? And she said, well, seeing as how I'm going to be up all night with Will, how about if I take 12 hours from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m.? I said, that sounds great. So you kind of get the idea here, but I think it's really amazing for young men and women to manage this kind of a process during the pre-tenure period. It's always a little stressful, but aren't they beautiful babies? So Libby is here in spirit today. She texted me this morning and said, be sure to get good feedback, and you go. All right, so now the talk. Some of you have seen the book called The Restoration Economy by Cunningham. It's an older book. I've gone back to look at this a couple times. The book is broken out by different chapters in what he calls the restoration economy: land, water, forest, all different types of domains. And despite its status as a dominant natural resource management activity with over $1 trillion spent annually in what is called the restoration economy, no research has explicitly addressed the business perspective. And there is a little kind of a business publication called Ecological Restoration, and there was a really nice article again in the same time period that featured some of our Montana businesses. And the author of this article said some of these businesses doing restoration are very good, but some are really not good businesses. And so what do we know about what differentiates those businesses that really do restoration well from those who do it just for the money and they do it very poorly? And so we thought this was a real opportunity to do some research. When I say business, there is this domain in restoration that's called practitioners. Who are practitioners and what's the difference between a practitioner and a business? And there's really I don't know that we've disentangled this as much as we should, but there's a really nice article on the economics, how much money is spent on restoration by Ben Dorr. And he says that the businesses are roughly evenly split between the scientific engineering and design consulting agencies that are paid to develop the designs and the physical construction and earth moving aspects, such as EnviroCon in Missoula, for example, is a really big one. The people who drive the big yellow machines and get out there and actually do the work. And so his study, he's got this really nice pie chart that shows how these are arrayed around types of businesses. And so what we do in our study is we essentially say if this is a for-profit business that is bidding for a job and has a payroll that they have to meet, and that has to come out of the proceeds from the project, that would distinguish it from an NGO, for example, or a government agency like a DEQ or a natural resource damages program, for example. And we do have some data from those stakeholders, because if you ask businesses to report, hey, how are you doing on restoration? They're going to say, hey, we're doing awesome. And so we do have other stakeholders that we use to validate, do the business seem to be telling us the same thing that other people are perceiving about those businesses? And that's kind of good business practice in collecting data. We sometimes call it triangulation or a different informant to validate another informant. And we'll get to the methodology in a little bit. Okay, so the first thing we did when we submitted our manuscript, and this is very much true in the domain that I publish in, which is in academic business journals, we always have something that's called a literature review, which essentially tells reviewers and readers what is the state of the art in this domain already. And so Libby and I looked at essentially 4 different domains of relevant literature, including studies of restoration practitioners, because some of those do include businesses, but they're not exclusively businesses. And when we looked, for example, at some of the literature that comes from the Society of Ecological Restoration, they use this word practitioner, but they really don't differentiate. Are they for-profit? Are they non-profit? Are they NGOs? Are they like the Clark Fork Coalition? And so we definitely looked at that, and there's some really good literature. I'd say some of the best is by Bernhardt, and I think most people know her name. There's a big literature on the economics of restoration, including job creation, economic output, and some of the authors I have here. And so when we talk about the economics of restoration, that is not what I mean by the business perspective. economics really talk about how much of the value of the land maybe was removed from forest management and put into protected forest land, for example. And those economic impacts are a totally different domain and methodological expertise than I have as a business person. In some schools, the economics department is part of the business school, but at many schools, economics is not part of the business school. So one problem that we've had in submitting this is when people hear the word business, they think that's a synonym for economics, and it is not. So that's been an issue that we've had to overcome. In addition, we looked at how stakeholders value outcomes from restoration, and I'm going to talk about this because from a business perspective, a business's success hinges upon doing restoration well over the long term because they have to maintain their reputation, but they also have incentives to cut corners in order to improve profitability. And so this idea of how stakeholders value various outcomes, do people value more the putting restoration on a river back into a pristine condition so we can have more tourism and recreation on the river, or do we want that water to be used for agricultural purposes to irrigate land, which maybe isn't as good for the land or for the fish? Does that resonate with you? Yeah. Okay, so we have some literature there. And then I actually have a graduate student who's been working on a project for a year now with me, looking at how do businesses value natural capital. And this is a huge body of work in this domain. And she's really struggled to kind of wrestle it into some meaningful taxonomy. And I think we're pretty close to getting a manuscript ready on how businesses value natural capital, which is different than how ecologists value natural capital. And I'm not going to get into that. It's kind of a side project. But at some point, I'll probably be presenting that project related to this because it's funded through the IOE. Okay, so what do we know from the business perspective about business impacts generally on the natural environment? There's a huge literature in business right now, and it falls under something that's called Organizations and the Natural Environment. So the acronym is ONE, O-N-E. And what we do know is there's a huge literature for the past 20 years that talk about how the negative impacts of business essentially are the reason we have to have restoration in the first place. It's mining, it's forestry, it's logging, it's roads, it's agriculture. And those are all business endeavors. And those negative impacts are the reason that we have environmental degradation. And so when I'm a business person on a plane, you know, I never know if the person I'm sitting next to is going to say, oh, you try to sell more people beanie babies and shit they don't need. It's like, yep, that's me. And then other people say, oh, you're responsible for raping and pillaging the environment. And I say, yep, that's me. You know, because I'm a business person, right? And then I'm saying this very tongue-in-cheek. Are you laughing yet? Yeah. I mean, there are all these stereotypes about business, but stereotypes are sometimes pretty well-deserved. And so about 20 years ago, this organization in the natural environment started a huge literature base that's continued on now. And what we're looking at is how do businesses actually change this? How do they begin accounting for the negative environmental impacts? How do they essentially take this logic of consumption, selling people more shit, and changing, I'm sorry for swearing. Is it okay that I'm swearing? Okay. Okay, yeah, I just promise not to drop too many F-bombs, okay? And so the logic of business is inherently at odds with preserving the natural world at some level. And so I've got a separate domain of work that is positioned squarely in the business literature on this as opposed to positioned in the restoration area. And the project that Kathy mentioned that I had presented last time kind of falls in that area. So adding this business perspective on the environment was something that the reviewers of Restoration Ecology asked us to do, which we hadn't originally done, which I think actually makes for a stronger manuscript. And it surprised me that our reviewers of Restoration Ecology wanted more of this traditional business perspective, which I took to be a good sign, even though I'm not proud of the things that are listed here. I think it's a good sign that, you know, people want to understand that better. And then from a business perspective, again, when we publish in business journals, we have to have some theoretical model that grounds the research that we're doing. So in my domain of business, I might look at theories of managerial decision-making or theories of consumer behavior and consumer psychology. And so we had a whole section in the manuscript on the theoretical perspective of social ecological system, and the reviewer said, we don't understand why you have a lit review or theory. Just get to the method and tell us what your data are. It's like, okay, we'll just cut those right out of there then. And so we moved a lot of this to the back end of the manuscript in terms of more of the implications and the contributions. But that did surprise me, because usually in my domain, if we don't have a lit review and a theory, people say you have no theory, so we're going to reject you, the manuscript right out of the box. And so social ecological systems, I think for this audience, I probably don't need to spend too much time on, because my bet is everybody's really familiar with social ecological systems. Essentially, just at a high level, we've got human behaviors and we have the natural environment, and they go like this. And the idea of social ecological systems is to look at those reciprocal impacts on one another. And that's what we're doing with our business study. We're looking at the impact of business on ecology, and then how those ecological opportunities provide opportunities for businesses. Make sense? Okay, so that's a really high level overview. And the sentence that we have in our NSF proposal is, well, businesses are clearly social entities, the character and implications of the practices that those businesses use introduces a unique perspective. And this has caused us a lot of problems with this statement, because they say, okay, so why do you have a separate thing that's called business? Why isn't it just included in the social group? Well, it's because social group doesn't include for-profit entities, and that issue makes it really unique. And so we haven't really figured out how to position business, because it is a social entity, but it doesn't act like other social entities. So this is one thing we're wrestling with in our resubmission for the NSF. Our basic research question for this study was, how do businesses engaged in the practice of restoration manage the trade-offs and complexities between ecological goals on the one hand and business objectives on the other? And that was a very open-ended research question, because there was no research that we could find on how businesses make these decisions. And as I mentioned previously, we did also, and I'll get to our context in a minute, we also asked the government agencies and the NGOs their perceptions of those business activities to figure out whether there are systematic biases or differences between the parties and how they viewed those business actions. One of the methods that is commonly used in social sciences for a phenomenon that is poorly understood is qualitative research. And qualitative research essentially means that you either go and observe people doing what they do, and this is really common. For example, Intel, the company that makes the chip inside your computer, they like to go and watch how people are using technology. And the idea is, by understanding how people use technology, they can make better features and products that map onto that, because people sometimes don't articulate clearly what it is they want, but observation is a really good way to get the data. And so we used a qualitative method where we used structured interviews to interview all the businesses, and I'll get to how many in a minute, that were involved in the restoration on the upper Mohr River project. And again, this is used when the phenomenon is poorly understood. And the way that we did this is we called up some of the key players at the DP2 and the Nexus Resource Damages program, and we said, what businesses are engaged in doing work on this project? Contracted with, who have you hired? And that's all public information. It's got a record of decision, for example. It's all stuff bidding through what we do. And so that's all public. And essentially, we would kind of knock them off one at a time, in the sense of calling, scheduling an interview, and then saying, what other businesses are you working with? The snowball technique to get as many referrals as possible to get as many businesses. And I'll get to our table of those businesses in a minute. And then we ended up with 21 interviews. And this has been a problem for us on the NSF, because they said, we treat businesses as part of social. So we're not really sure about that. But the businesses are a really unique perspective that we've never seen before. We really like that. But you have such a small sample size that there's no way you can draw any conclusions from a quantitative perspective. Regression analysis. And so when you take a census of all the businesses who are engaged, and you have 21, you can somehow make up more data. And so what we're doing this summer to address the sample size issue is we've received another mini grant from the IOE, where we're going to buy the lists, which you can do from the Society of Ecological, to send out a survey to essentially ask all the businesses who are part of that membership, how many projects do you work on, how many other businesses do you usually work with, how often is it that you get the same projects, the same companies over time. And so we have to have data to essentially say you're concerned about small sample size, but that is the census. And that is all the businesses that are there. So if you think the business perspective is worth studying, you're going to have to live with the end that we have on any given project. And many of those businesses are replicated across multiple projects if they're doing good work. And then you have, in our discipline, a non-independence of observation. It's the same businesses doing the same work on multiple projects. And so it's been a really tough methodology for us. And it's, you know, we're taking baby steps is how I feel to kind of get this data. So 21 is not a huge number because when I show you the next table, and I'm sorry this is hard to see, our business respondents were only 9 respondents. And you'll see design firms, engineering, bed growers, the earth movers, bed growers, tribal business. And then we had quite a few state agencies, so 2 respondents to state agency bonds, so we had 4 respondents because some of these state agencies were NGOs and citizen advisories. And so when you say, oh my gosh, you have more data from non-business people than business people, that's reality right now. So I'm not sure how that's going to fly with this next round of reviews at Restoration Ecology. So I don't know, Libby and I, we always take bets. Do you do this with your co-authors once you submit a manuscript? You take bets on what the reason for the rejection is going to be. Do you guys do this? You don't do this. You gotta have some fun because, you know, I want her reason to be the reason she has to buy me a drink because, anyway, it is a little pessimistic, but okay. Let's see. I'm gonna get to the data here. So, interestingly, our researchers at Restoration Ecology want us to put more about our institutional review board process and informed consent and how the approval process worked to secure the business's cooperation. And for those of you in the natural science arena, anytime that you collect data that involves people, it has to be cleared through the institutional review board. So Ray Calloway and I are doing a project where we're interviewing ecologists on a totally different project related more to my theme of innovation and technology that Kathy mentioned earlier. And I had to secure an IRB approval for the 2 of us. And I sent it to Ray. And I said, Ray, if you want to have any credibility with the social scientists now that you're heading up EPSCoR nationwide, you know, or statewide, I said, you got to put this prominently in your office, like have it framed and let people know that you understand the social science side of this. He still doesn't get that that would signal credibility. So you guys can give him some shit when he comes here in a couple weeks. Like you could say, hey, Ray, do you understand what we have to go through to get IRB approval for human subjects? And if he says no, call him out on it. Okay? Don't you think that's important for him to know and understand? See, and I think he has no appreciation for that. Even though I went through it, I sent it to him, I said, frame this, hang it on your wall, you're going to have so much credibility with the social scientists. He's like, he likes to crawl in the, what?
You're being awfully
You think so? Okay. He likes just to crawl through the grass and count things, you know, so anyway. Thank you for laughing. Don't tell him I said that. You are, I can tell. He's going to make me buy him a scotch for that then. Okay. So a problem that we had in the Restoration Ecology manuscript is the reviewer said, all you have are people's opinions. You don't have any data. And we didn't know what to do with that. It's like, yeah, people's opinions are how they make decisions, and those decisions affect whether the ecology is done right or wrong, and so the opinions are the data. They said, well, how do you know it's not your own opinion? And it's like, well, it's because we have actual verbatim quotes from the data. No, those are just quotes. No, that is the data. And so it was a little bit tough for Libby and I to not be too snarky in our reviewer comments about the data. And so I don't know if I've made that clear to the people who aren't doing human issues research, but I've never encountered that as a business person. Like, there's no doubt in my domain that qualitative interview data is real data. Okay, so anyway, I'm sorry if this sounds bad, we dumbed down the methodology for our reviewers, and hopefully it'll fly this time. We were talking about hermeneutic analysis, and I think it was just too much. All right, then, it's just so interesting being a business person. So we have this beautiful figure that shows how the ecology and the business interact, and these reciprocal feedbacks and all the tensions that we had. And the reviewer said, you don't need a figure. And we always use a figure in social sciences research to show the interrelationships between that. Like, you guys looked right away. You said, what do you mean they don't want your figure? So we wrote in our reviewer notes, with all due respect, we know you think our figure is very simplistic, but social science research always has a figure to show the interrelationships of the phenomenon. Would you please let us keep it? So that was a nice thing to say, right? So they can write back and say, no, we won't let you keep it. In which case, we'll take it out. It's an interesting process. Don't you think it's an interesting process? Can't you see Libby and I having a glass of wine over this? Yeah, we're three. Okay.
You want to talk about why you felt it was so important to keep it in that
I can't answer that, and probably Libby could. From my perspective, I feel like a figure should encapsulate in one.
well, they figure, but the manuscript at
Restoration Ecology. It's because they published our first data set on this project, and we felt that it would help with the continuity of the project to also have the second in there as well. So, if we get rejected at the second go around, we certainly would. We have another manuscript under review at SNR on quantitative data on this as opposed to qualitative data. So we've got something under review there too. Let's see, so I'm going to go through each of these. I'm looking at the time. So I wanted to end about 1:45 just to kind of talk about some other issues and where we're going with the project. And I have 5 key findings, and then I have 5 key implications. And so, I probably won't be able to spend 1 minute on each one because I spend a lot more time than that. So I think what I'll do is I'll cherry pick what I think were the interesting or controversial ones. And then if you want a copy of the working paper, I have the working paper. Or if you want a copy of the slides, I have a copy of the slides. And I really believe in free information dissemination because I think everybody should build on everybody's research. And I don't have a strong sense of, oh, we're not ready to share this yet. It's like anybody who wants to see it, we're happy to let you see it, help us, with feedback, whatever it is. The first thing that was really interesting is that of the Montana businesses that we spoke with, and there was one national, let me rephrase that. There was one national business in the set that had an office in Montana doing work on the Upper Clark Fork. And there's one huge international business that also was doing work on the Upper Clark Fork. But these businesses typically are located in Montana, and the reason for that is to get a state contract for state of Montana work, they give a preference to Montana state businesses for lots of reasons. And so whether or not our data are generalizable to companies outside the state is something we don't know, or whether the data are generalizable to smaller projects that aren't highly visible, like the Superfund cleanup on the Upper Clark Fork River. And I'll kind of highlight where our findings may be not generalizable because of the context. But for us, everybody we spoke to from a business perspective said it's a passion for the resource and doing right things for Montana resources. and the business does come into it, but it was really secondary. And so when I asked the business people, tell me how you bid on a project, tell me about the training you got to manage profit and loss, I'm an ecologist. I have no idea. It's just kind of, we throw it up in the air and hope it all works out. And so it really surprised me for most of the companies that there was not a lot of sophistication, that they just wanted the project because they wanted to see the land cleaned up and restored to a more pristine condition. And that's what motivated them, which to me made me really happy. And it was unexpected. We really thought there would be more of an explicit, oh, we really cut corners, we got to manage our profit, you know, we got to manage our people. And they didn't say that. So did the state agencies say that? Did they say the businesses were really sort of skimming off the top, or were they doing things that compromised it? Our state agency said, we look to the businesses to tell us what the best practices are and what we need to be doing. And so this was something that just was really gratifying. And so when I look at kind of what the goals were, when describing the goals for the project, the most often cited ecological goals were restoring clean water, aquatic habitat, riparian areas, and geomorphological functioning. So the businesses all talked, those were the primary goals. They didn't say to make a ton of money. And the social goals, respondents mentioned ensuring agricultural livelihoods can continue, along with the need to manage recreation resources. And one respondent said, we just want to keep our stakeholders happy, which was really interesting, I thought. And so one of the reviewers said, take out that quote. And they said, that should not be the objective. It's like, no, it is data. You can't just take out the data that you don't like. And so it's just a curious process. You guys can see the reviews if you want to. It was kind of interesting. All right, so this one turned out to not be the most interesting one, and we thought it would be, and that's kind of why we led with it. This was one of the most interesting findings. So the whole aspect of risk management. How do you manage risk as a business? And this is a big topic in business, whether it's managing supply chains or managing water or manage your huckleberry stock or whatever it is. And especially in these natural resource environments where you could design your project, plant all your veg, and then get a 100-year flood the next year that comes down and wipes everything out. And so essentially that is what happened on one of the reaches of the Upper Clark Fork River early in the process. And as a result, many of the businesses said, we don't want to be a poster child for failure. And because they wanted to use taxpayer dollars wisely, because that's who was paying for this project, they had a tendency to over-engineer the project so that a flood wouldn't wipe out what was happening. And they were very conservative in the design. And so in our original submission, Libby and I talked a lot about this risk issue because it's a big deal in business. And my area of innovation says you should fail fast, fail often, learn from failure. There's this whole dialogue in literature on business. And also there's something that's called prospect theory. And you might have heard it, the book right now called The Undoing Project. Have any of you heard of this book? So that's all about prospect theory, which essentially says people are not rational beings and they don't measure the upside potential of a gain and the downside risk or loss of failure in equivalent ways. There's asymmetrical weighting of this. And we found that in our data, that the risk of a failure led to much more investment of resources than probably was called for. And so we actually said in our original submission, it would be nice to see some of these businesses actually trained in how to calibrate that risk, which is how we do it in business. And we talk about de-biasing risk assessments, and we have risk portfolio tools that are used. And the reviewers said, oh, that would be really bad for restoration, because probably being risk averse is a good thing for restoration because it leads to safe design standards. And I said, that the reviewers really helped me, at least. I can't speak for Libby because I think she thought some of them were just not useful. It helped me come to a more nuanced perspective of how risk in the natural resource environment is different than in a traditional business environment. And bringing that more nuanced perspective of risk into some of our implications is something that we worked really hard on in this round of revision for restoration ecology. So first we had risk from the natural resource environment, but then we also had risk from I feel like I skipped a slide. I thought this was next, sorry. Individuals had different predispositions to risk. So some people are inherently risk averse, right? You know them. And others of people are inherently risk takers and more adventurous. And that personality had a really big impact on the way different projects were managed. And so again, for us, this was different than just the inherent risk in the natural resource environment. And a lot of our quotes talked about what was the right mindset in terms of this appetite for risk. And some people said without a specific individual who was willing to tolerate some risk in the project, you would have someone with a different point of view, which wouldn't be good because they'd over-engineer the solution and spend too much money on it. So this individual propensity to risk is something that, again, we study in business because it is an individual personality level variable. And understanding those personalities is key. I happen to have a partner who has a very high appetite for risk, and it drives me crazy. It's like ice. Could we go ice climbing? How much does the ice fracture when I hit it with my ice axe? Could I sleep with my ice axes at night so I can like dream about this risk stuff? And it's like, oh, I don't even want to see the ice. Okay. Some people said solutions define what success looks like on. So one of our quotes said, what will we call success? What would make us go back and fix something that nature wiped out? At what point if the river does something we had not counted on, maybe that's okay and we should just let it go. But sometimes we might need to go back in there and fix it. And so defining that ahead of time, and this is consistent with the literature in business, we have confirmation bias. And to de-bias this, you have to decide in advance, what is your role going to be? And doing that in advance helps overcome some of these problems. And then a lot of the people we talked to said, we need to get away from this over-engineering and let the stream heal itself and nudge it in the right direction. But this was not very common on the big project we studied. Right. The science practice nexus. This looks like some people are responding to this too. This is pretty common in every discipline, whether you're in medicine, whether you're in business, we have the science practice disconnect, whether you're in restoration ecology. And this came out quite a bit in our interviews again. And what the business has said is that there isn't consensus on best practices restoration. And we use this word best practices for essentially science. What is science? They said nobody knows what best practices science is because we're an emerging field, we're still learning this. Nobody wants to be a poster child for failure, so we use tried and true techniques, and we're not willing to experiment very much. So how do you get science into practice with that kind of a mentality? It's pretty tough. And people also talked a lot about the use of the Roskin method and how the Roskin method is not really best practices science. And at the same time, because the agencies that were funding this wanted the Roskin method used because it was so prominent, that's what they would fund, and they wouldn't fund it if it wasn't the Roskin method. And so there's this interplay not only between the business and the science, but also the agencies who are doing the funding that leads to this really complicated dynamic. And again, this came out in lots of ways in our interviews. So let's see. So there's this quote from, I think this is either the Merlander or the Cabin et al. Site. Restoration scientists, the ecologists would tell you that the science itself is a hurdle. But it's such an emerging area that you could study these systems to death and it might not change what you do on the ground. And so I didn't know from my perspective if this was like a rationale, a rationalization for not trying science because there's no agreement on it, or if in fact, because there was no agreement, it was really, you couldn't just throw the spaghetti at the wall to see what fit, what stuck. And so on this quote, some of these, we should have, in hindsight, dug a little deeper on them, and that's when you go back and look at qualitative data, you're always saying, oh, that would have been a great area to throw. We really missed that one. I did all the business interviews, and so I kind of look at this and I think, I'm better trained than that. This is something I should have followed up on. But, you get so much data in such a little period of time, you don't realize the nuggets sometimes till you're writing it up. Okay, innovation. I'm always focused on innovation. I'm watching the time here. This really relates to risk again. We want to use new technology, but oftentimes it's not proven, it's not cost efficient, it's not cost effective. We heard that a lot. Well, new things, they're not proven, they're not cost effective. This cost effective is a classic business issue. And that was a reason that they didn't use new techniques. So what I want to do is I want to study some restoration businesses, and there are two that I know about of Missoula that all they do is experimentation. They just want to try new things. And so I want to get their perspective compared to the ones we talked to that had been funded through this project. I think it would be interesting. And I'm going to skip this. We only had one person in our study that was on the ground implementation. This has not been studied enough. We heard consistently that the people who stick the veg in the ground, they don't care what the design is. They either want to get it done quickly or they think they can do it better. It was one of those two things. But this wasn't a strong enough theme that we felt like we could say anything about it credibly, but we felt like it's a really important underexplored area. Do you guys know of any research on the ground, the people actually doing the work, the yellow diggers and the hard hats and things like that? The people we talked to, like I said, we had one business person who ran those people, and then we had one person who was actually doing the work on the ground. And we got really mixed signals. And so we want to go back and explore that a little bit more. All right, so where does this take us? In contrast to the literature on the negative effects of business on the environment, that these restoration businesses do put the ecological goals first. So that was just really, for me, a happy finding. And what can state agencies and NGOs do? They should just be really explicit, How do you plan on covering your costs of doing business? How does that affect the ecological integrity of the project? And how are we going to know that up front? And just making that an explicit part of the conversation, business people should be able to answer that. And if they can't, that's a problem. Managing risks. So we spent, as I said, quite a bit of time on this. Reframing it as an opportunity to learn. And as I've mentioned, we talked a little bit in the paper about prospect theory. Storm Cunningham, The Restoration Economy, he has a section in every chapter about this over-engineering phenomenon in restoration ecology. And he had some great quotes, and I just pulled out one for this talk. He called them farcical engineering blunders, which I think is a great quote, but essentially it says this over-engineering leads to excessive costs, and he called them these farcical engineering blunders. And he has a little table in each chapter about kind of how does this work on the ground. And those little boxes in his book are really great. And so I think that if we could rename this and not call it failure, but call it learning. And so our reviewers had quite a bit of information about adaptive management. And they said, we want you to add more sites about adaptive management. This is what you're talking about is really consistent with that. And so that was a missed opportunity for us in the first submission, and we've remedied that here in the second submission. And what businesses say is uncertainty is typically a negative, and the goal is not to learn from what you're doing. But what we need to do is figure out how to do restoration in a way that we can learn from it. But our respondents said, they never go into it with that perspective. And, we hate to say never in qualitative research, but pretty much they said never. Never done from this perspective. I see a lot of people shaking their head like that makes sense. So going backwards here, this again is kind of my domain of what I study in business, and I'm just going to end with this slide here. The innovator's dilemma says in business that my existing routines and skills blind me as a company to new ways of doing things. So the classic examples are, why did Kodak not make the switch to digital photography? Why did Sony not take the Walkman into MP3 players? We could go after company after company who's had to get bailed out because they think that what they're doing is the best way to do things. And they face the dilemma of, if I go into something new, I cannibalize my existing source of success. And that fear of cannibalization, not cannibalism for, you know, it's a business term, cannibalization, means that companies have a dated skill set that lags these new innovations that come down the pipe. And so we put a section in our discussion section about how to cultivate a willingness to try new practices in the restoration arena and how to help balance risk avoidance with strategies to experiment with innovation. And this really falls under this adaptive learning, adaptive management paradigm. And what we find in business is that this is it's a function of the values and beliefs of the organization. So we all talk about something that's called organizational culture, right? And organizational culture is something that exists in these businesses as well, but they don't have this as a shared cultural value. And what do we know about culture change? It actually starts from the top of an organization. As much as we'd like to say it's ground up, you know, organic, bottom up, the fact is lots of people are unhappy at work and they don't have the tools to actually make the culture change. It's a function of what is rewarded, what is measured, what is evaluated that essentially institutes what's important from the top. And we call it in business symbolic storytelling of the CEO that tells the employees what is valued in an organization. And so I think this is something that if we pursue this, you know, from a quantitative perspective, this is something that's really interesting to me. So I think I'm just going to stop there and see how this is resonating with you and what observations you have and what ideas you might have, because I told Lydia I would take notes. Julia.
So thank you so much. So interesting. I'm really looking forward to learning more. How much
Thanks,
is,
Joan. Bye.
How much is the culture that these companies that you're observing a function of the fact that they're responding to state and federal mandates, and you know, in the risk aversion space, these have to be our least innovative and most challenged kinds of, you know, the worst contract you want to get to experiment with, right?
Yeah, and so, and especially this came out in our data set too, and I have offended some people when I've said this, and it makes me feel bad because I don't mean to offend anybody. Some people in our data set suggest that the people who actually manage these projects for federal and state agencies are the most risk-averse people anyway, because they choose to work at the government, and then they remind me I'm a government employee for the state of Montana. Even though I consider myself a rabble-rouser and a rogue, that those people themselves are inherently the most conservative as well. So what we've put in our limitations, Julia, here is that our research is very context-specific. And because of its Superfund status, the projects are highly visible. They come from the state of Montana taxpayers. Local companies did most of the work. And so we have no idea if we did this on smaller projects or if I went and studied the 2 companies in Missoula that are doing really innovative things, how much of this is just context specific. And so that's a reality, and I think it's a really good point. So what's your take on that, Julia?
Well, it makes me really interested in some of the work that's happening over here as a point of comparison where individuals are undertaking restoration as part of maybe not sometimes an explicit business model, but sometimes as part of a bigger business model. And what I know from the land manager standpoint is that there's this amazing spectrum of when you're managing your own land that you do have an adaptive learning cycle. And you think of these really creative people that are archetypes of large-scale restoration of properties that are typically private properties, right, where they have developed these really ingenious kinds of solutions. And so I wonder if, like, an interesting point of comparison in Montana might be some of the private stream restoration that is happening, and sort of who is operating in that space. Do the businesses themselves show personalities that are more experimental and risk tolerant? It just seems like, of all the topics that we could study in Montana, I think this is a great, like, Montana's sessions, because we have so much sort of natural laboratory. But yeah, so sort of like that private-public kind of comparison might be really interesting.
I think that would be really interesting, and qualitative research, probably you already know this, is that sometimes you actually select for variance. You select companies who are going to be inherently risk averse, and we probably have those, compared to companies that have this really progressive mindset about what does this mean over time for us to learn from this. And so we could sample for variance on those domains, for example.
And then companies have to create their market versus those that have the market created for them.
Yeah.
Right, where
Yep.
Superfund creates a market, whereas,
Yep.
you know, like Floating Islands has had their
Right.
created their own market.
Right, that's a really good example. And in our literature, we call that market driving versus market driven. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting, just you're next and then you're next. Yes, I'm going in order.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving this talk. It was really wonderful. And I'm one of Julia's graduate students, and we just got finished. We have a manuscript under review looking at natural gas production sites as a really complicated governance challenge on how they are restored and reclaimed after production. And a lot of this really resonated with what we found there. But I was wondering if there were any lines of questioning in your interviews about how the businesses interact with each other to complete the reclamation and the goals of the restoration, because what we found is that there's this like huge host of stakeholders who have independent contractors and folks from state agencies, and it really runs the gamut. And then there's just so much confusion among the businesses on how to complete the restoration that it creates, you know, some stalls in the process, and occasionally not adhering to the surface use agreements that are supposed to dictate how the restoration is supposed to happen. So I'm wondering if you heard anything from the businesses.
When we studied the dynamics of the stakeholders, we did not study explicitly the business dynamics within the businesses. We were, what came out in our data set more was the conflict between the state agencies and the federal agencies, and their conflict, the conflict between the state agencies and the landowners, and the lack of what they perceived as timely engagement, timely participation. So those kind of swamped any of these other issues you might be talking about. And so, but we didn't explicitly probe for that either. We kind of looked at what were the big barriers to completing your projects, and they all talked about these external conflicts and dynamics that had a negative impact on timing and moving forward. But that was much bigger than anything that happened within the business domain itself that didn't surface for us. Yeah. Let's see, you were next.
Okay. So I think maybe my perspectives are sort of different. So I've worked with some restoration in eastern Montana with coal miners. I've worked on this kind of things with the Forest Service. So they're basically doing their own. There's a sub business within the company, which is doing the business. And I wonder if you're thinking about that. So again, the miners, I think they're looking to do a good job. And one of the things that they're having some concerns about is when it's going to get looked at again. And as to one example, we were working on some vegetation, and they want to get their bond back. So they'd like to say, well, if we plant some new vegetation, and if it goes for 3 years, if it's looking great, are we okay? And I mean, we would all hope an ecological theory might lead you to think that that would be okay. But I've got one 25-year study, and what was happening after the first year was unbelievable. And after the second year, and after the fourth year, and after the 8th year, we're looking pretty good, but by 16, it's gone down. And that might do something with respect to your risk averseness thing. And then if you think of foresters who are replanting in a place where you have to, where there's been logging that you've supervised, you're supposed to put back as many trees as were originally there, and check it out in 5 years. And if it's not there, you're supposed to replant, check it out again in 5 years. And if it's not there, check it again in 5 years. And I think most people give up if you've got 3 cycles of losing out in 5 years. So I think it's just really interesting to that you're dealing. If I try to think myself, I feel like west of the Rockies, I'm going to expect a lot more little businesses doing the kind of thing that I think you're talking about than east. And maybe that's just my perspective. Do you think?
Are you asking me, Ted?
Sure.
I haven't thought about it geographically that way. I think by industry and by what it speaks to is this idea that across the restoration space, there are very specific kinds of business opportunities that come out of different mandates, essentially, right? Like very few people, aside from private landowners, are restoring this. Right, it comes out of the mandate, which is either state and federal policy around the given industry or Superfund issues. What are the other water restoration kind of drivers? I'm not exactly sure, but then that probably influences the business structure, the structure of the enterprises overall. Private sector space, maybe more than geography.
Scary, you don't want any. What?
Who are you?
Well, I'm a
Don't be
professor
scared.
in college.
Okay. That would explain why you know Ray so well then.
Well,
Yeah, yeah. How do I manage the time here? Because I've got lots of hands up and people told me that I should end at 1. So what's your advice to me?
give them a chance to leave, but they'll leave all the time they want.
Okay, that sounds good. If you need to leave, thank you for coming. For those of you who want to ask more questions, I'm going to hang out here because I've got lots of time with Julia afterwards. So let's see. So you're going to be next, and then you, and then you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so what I got is like you have a vision for this paper and this work, and that essentially you're going to talk about these reviewers are changing your vision. Arguably, they're saying for the better, and you're kind of saying not for the better. So why is the publication like so important? Is that the only way to gain credibility?
Yeah, so a couple of things for me. One is I think it's really important to get that the business perspective offers a good lens to help understand this phenomenon, and we haven't really understood that lens very well. I think in some domains, the manuscript has been made better, like looking at the way risk is a more nuanced thing than what I said originally. It's like, yeah, risk tolerance is a really good thing, and we should somehow figure out how to get this, fear of failure, get rid of it. And so I think it's made it better. The places where they pushed back have been a little bit tongue-in-cheek, like, does the figure really matter? Does taking the word tensions out really matter? Like, I've been a little bit sarcastic about that. But Libby and I did disagree. At the end, I really wrote to the editor sincerely. I think that the reviews actually helped us think through a lot of these issues in a more complete fashion. I've been a little bit sarcastic about how they use the data as not data and things like that. But I think a lot of that is methodological debates that are common in any discipline, like what's the right method? That's always debated in every discipline. So for me, it is getting the business perspective into this domain to complement what is already out there. I view that as really an important thing. So that's my answer. You might get a different answer from Libby, though, if she was here. Yeah. Okay.
Restoration Ecology is the hallmark journal for Society-Ecological Restoration too, which
It's just like I feel like coming from like, I'm totally on like theory, like I have no experience, like I'm glad you have, but it's like 2017 seems like a totally different year than like 1980 in terms of credibility in science and given social media and everything we have.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
is it really this like bad important?
Yeah.
Like, are we on this verge of like a transition in credibility?
No, I don't think so, and especially for an academic. I mean, I look at the impact of citations, and to have the first piece of research in restoration ecology on business, I think it's going to be, this sounds arrogant and I don't mean it that way, I think it's going to be highly influential, and I think it is going to change the discipline, and the only way you get that influence is to have a double-blind peer-reviewed published manuscript that is used in doctoral seminars and referenced, and I'm socialized to think that way though as an academic. Yeah. So, but look on Google Scholar, look at the H-index, all those things. It matters. It matters. Let's see. Go ahead.
So I support this concept of risk aversion related to close attachment to a government agency. The state engineer for USDA, NRCS told me we over-engineer everything because we can't have a train wreck. USDA, NRCS.
NRCS. I don't know NRCS.
Natural Resources Conservation Service.
Okay.
So all their BMPs, he said, we over-engineer.
BNDs.
It's all, NRCS is all the federal money that goes on private land. So they
Okay.
do like all stream restoration,
Okay.
lots of funding for that. But then they
In my interdisciplinary group, we have banned acronyms. You have to be able to understand what people say. So I'm sorry. I don't
No,
know.
I was trying to
Yeah.
say
Yeah. Okay.
Natural Resources Conservation Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So the state engineer said we over-engineer all these on-the-ground practices because we can't have a train wreck on taxpayer dollars.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, same thing.
You know, and that's
Yeah.
across all their conservation
Okay.
programs, from plantings to structures.
Okay.
But my question
Back to
is,
Julia's thing, yeah.
I've been looking into some supply chain management issues
That's my home discipline in business.
with local food systems,
Yeah,
particularly beef.
yeah. We've got 2 people at UM who are doing local food systems and supply chain management. Suzanne Tillman, you will love her.
But I've seen this issue of size of a business related to what they're willing to engage in and like business self-study,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's risk issues, strategic supply chain management, you know, and a lot of literature says small and medium enterprises just can't do it well.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if, you know, strategic risk management within that restoration business, and these are very small businesses, right?
Yeah, some of them are, but
2
some of
to
them are
20
huge.
people.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, if it's CH2M Hill. Or,
yeah. So your question is
there gonna
do
be a
small
difference?
businesses do effective self-scrutiny compared to larger businesses that have a process for doing those kinds of evaluations?
Right.
Yeah. You know, I haven't seen any literature on that. I'm always reluctant to shoot from the hip unless I tell you that, because then it's just my personal opinion as opposed to based on my knowledge. I haven't seen anything on that, but what I do know in this area is that if you are a provider to a large business in a supply chain, that those large businesses do somehow use their protocols to evaluate whether you're adhering to what is best practices. So if you want to sell your products, that you're an organic dairy farmer, to a larger company, they want to make sure that you're adhering to what their standards are. And those companies are really trying to improve their standards because society is expecting those businesses to improve them. So I would say if they're just part of a cooperative, for example, maybe the cooperative could take that on, but if they're actually selling to larger businesses, those businesses have to verify that their suppliers are adhering to their standards. And so I think that there probably is a mechanism for that, but it wouldn't be from internally within them themselves. It would be whoever they're sourcing to. I didn't say that very well, but hopefully you knew what I meant.
Sure, and I mean that model is good with like Organic Valley.
Okay.
And that's how
Yeah.
they do it.
Yeah.
Is that small?
Yeah.
area.
But otherwise, you can look at what are the standards for those scorecards, or what they're typically called in supply chain management. So you have vendor scorecards. And there's no reason a small and medium business couldn't get what those scorecards are and use them, because every industry has them, whether it's the outdoor apparel industry or whether it's the organic food industry. Every industry has those scorecards for that supply chain. Really common in the healthcare industry, for example.
So in your project, would you see the big multi-state company that maybe has to hire the local earth mover for this project? Would they impose that same sort of management on them to make sure their bid was?
100%. 100%, yes. Mhm. Yep. Yep.
What's that?
Thank you. And thank you for your comment. I really appreciate it a lot. It's a really good perspective about the credibility and the social media thing. I think that was really a good observation.
Most just thinking about like this huge gap we have from like a scientist, like a public person.
Yeah. Oh, that science communication gap to the society as a whole, that is a huge gap. That's a whole nother dialogue too. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. She's next and then you're next.
Well, I actually gotta get going, but I was just gonna mention 2 references you might be
Oh,
interested
thank
in.
you.
Two
Yeah.
photographers who've done some work kind of in the field. I don't know how relevant they may or be, but Rebecca Lade wrote a book, Fields and Streams, and it's really about the Roskin Wars, but some business perspectives in there.
Can you spell her last name for me?
Lave,
Okay, that's how I spelled it. Okay, good.
and she's at Indiana.
Okay.
And then a co-author of hers, I think they're in grad school together, and then his name is Morgan Robertson,
Okay.
and he's now at Wisconsin. And his work is more around wetland mitigation banking and how restoration agents or restoration
Wetland mitigation what?
banking or
Banking.
basically
Oh,
creating what like
got it,
just
got it.
right in one
Okay.
place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you too. I'll probably see you at the IOE meeting in a couple of weeks.
We'll be at the geography conference.
Yeah,
Oh.
thanks.
Schedule it second time.
Okay, well, I won't see you then. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was really interested by the comment that you made about how the government looks to businesses for best practices.
Yeah.
And that just caught me off guard a little bit, thinking that that probably really can create a lot of ad hoc approaches to restoration. And yet all of these companies are working on the same project. So I'm wondering if you know of any kind of collaboration that they've done, or if they were communicating with each other, what that looks like.
Just to make sure I understand the question correctly, so the government in this case had a record of decision that was part of the natural resource damages against ARCO for the Upper Clark Fork River. And the businesses then had to bid on that, and even while they were bidding on it, some of those businesses were outside consultants to make sure that the projects were actually designed properly, that the design was solid, that it wasn't, people who weren't informed about what needed to be done, that there was some vetting or some oversight. And so with that as the context, ask your question again for me.
Yeah, so I still think that what I'm guessing is there's a different definition that each company uses for what successful restoration actually means on the ground.
And we asked explicitly in our interview protocol, what does success look like for you?
And so do you know if there's any collaboration and were those definitions so vastly different that it's obvious companies weren't communicating with each other, or was there a sense that there was an agreed upon definition?
Well, the definition of success, we always try to loop back to what the goals were in the interview. So we asked early on, what were your goals for the project, and how did you define success, and how did you measure success, and how did that vary based on the time horizon, which was a very big issue. Many people said we've got enough money in the budget to manage the veg maintenance for 5 years out, but we don't have enough money to manage it for 15 years out, and so we don't know what's going to happen. We don't have that longevity. But we did not see huge variance across the businesses on this. And I don't know if that's because they were all going for this record of decision, that they all had kind of this common thing. The differences we saw more were between the NGOs, for example, that talked about these things like keeping their stakeholders happy, compared to the businesses, which were, we just want to do the right thing by this resource because we treasure our state. We want to put it back to this, non-polluted status. But again, I think if there was more variance in the types of projects we studied, going back to what Julia said, I think probably there would be some differences. I just think this is a huge area to tease some of these things out. And so I'm really looking forward to our summer research. I just hired a graduate student for the summer to help design the survey that is a nationwide survey about some of these issues in addition to the business demographics. So if you want to provide some input to that, I always feel like once we have a data set, if you wanted to break off a part of it, if we collected some data for you, collecting data is so special, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate it.